The last man off that boat never spoke again. Not a word, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. He lived another 41 years after that expedition, and in all that time, he communicated only by writing things down on small slips of paper. His family said that when he slept, which was rare, he would wake up choking on air, clawing at his own throat, and the only sound that ever left his mouth was a low, wet moan that did not sound like it belonged to a living person. I know this because I spent 7 years tracking down every piece of this story, every letter, every journal entry, every family secret buried in the cold, quiet corners of a country that has been trying to forget what happened in the waters north of Iceland in the summer of 1921, and what I found does not fit neatly into any world I thought I understood. So let me tell you what happened. From the very beginning, the way it was told to me by the people who carried it like a stone in their chest for the rest of their lives. It started the way most disasters start, with something that looked like a good idea. In the spring of that year, a small group of men, 11 in total, set out from a fishing village on the northern coast of Iceland. The village was one of those places that only exists because the sea allows it to. The houses were low and dark, built from wood and stone, pressed against the earth like they were hiding from the wind. The harbor smelled of salt and old fish and the kind of cold that gets into your teeth. The people there were hard people, not because they wanted to be, but because the land and the water gave them no other choice. They fished for herring mostly, and in those years, herring meant everything. It meant money, food, heat in winter, shoes for children. The whole economy of that stretch of coast ran on the silverbacks of fish that came in great clouds through the deep channels between Iceland and the open Atlantic. The 11 men who boarded that vessel were not explorers in the way you might think of explorers. They were not rich. They were not famous. They were fishermen and sailors who had been hired by a small research group based out of a European university to help with the survey of deep water marine life in the waters northwest of Iceland. The idea was simple enough. A few of the university men wanted to catalog what lived in the deep trenches and canyons that cut through the ocean floor in that part of the North Atlantic, places where the water drops from a few hundred feet to over 1,000 in the span of a mile, places where the sunlight gives up and the world below becomes something else entirely. The fishermen were hired because they knew the water, knew the currents, knew how to keep a boat alive in seas that could turn murderous without warning. They were the muscle and the knowledge. The university men were the curiosity. The boat itself was called, and I am translating loosely here, something close to the patient one. It was a wooden-hulled vessel, maybe 60 feet long, rigged for both sail and a small engine that burned diesel and belched black smoke that you could smell for a quarter mile. It was not a beautiful boat. It was not built for comfort. It was built for surviving. And in those waters, that was all that mattered. The men loaded it with nets, dredges, sample jars, ropes, and enough dried fish and hard bread to last them 3 weeks. They brought lanterns because the days were long in June, but the fog could make noon feel like dusk. And they brought a single rifle, not for hunting, but because the captain, a quiet, wide-shouldered man who had been fishing those waters since he was 12 years old, said he never went to sea without one, and when someone asked him why, he just looked at them and said nothing. I want you to understand something about these men before I go any further, because what makes this story hurt is not the thing that happened to them. It is who they were before it happened. The captain had a daughter who was 7 years old, and every time he left the harbor, she would stand on the dock and hold up a small painted stone she had found on the beach, and he would wave back until he could not see her anymore. One of the younger crewmen had just gotten married 3 weeks before the expedition, and his wife was already expecting their first child. The cook, an older man with a bad leg from a net accident years earlier, had a habit of singing old songs under his breath while he worked, songs that nobody else on the boat knew the words to, songs from a time before any of them were born. These were real people, whole people. People with warm hands and cold mornings and the kind of quiet dreams that fishermen carry. Not dreams of glory, just dreams of coming home. The first few days of the expedition were, by all accounts, ordinary. They sailed northwest from the village, following the coast for a while before turning out into deeper water. The weather was cool but clear. The seas were calm, and the university men spent their time lowering nets and dredges into the water and pulling up samples of whatever lived down there. They found the usual things: Small fish, strange-looking invertebrates, the occasional deep-water species that none of them had seen before, but that the fishermen shrugged at because the sea always had more in it than anyone could name. The water out there was a deep, dark blue that looked almost black in certain light. And when you leaned over the rail and stared down into it, you could feel something in your chest. A kind of pulling, like the water wanted you to keep looking, wanted you to understand that what you were seeing on the surface was not even close to what was underneath. The water remembers. That is something the captain said on the third night, sitting on the deck with a pipe in his hand, looking out at the sea while the sky did that thing. It does in Iceland in June, where it never quite gets dark, just dims to a pale, bruised gold that sits on the horizon like a held breath. One of the university men asked him what he meant by that, and the captain said that the old fishermen believed the ocean kept a record of everything that had ever passed through it, every ship, every creature, every storm, and that if you spent enough time on the water, you could feel the weight of all those memories pressing up from below. The university man laughed, not cruelly, just the way educated men sometimes laugh at things they think are quaint. The captain did not laugh back. He just kept looking at the water. On the fifth day, they reached the area they had come to study, a place where the ocean floor dropped away into a series of deep canyons that the fishermen called, roughly translated, the Old Wounds. The name alone should tell you something. These were not places the fishermen liked to go. The fishing was poor there because the water was too deep and too cold and the currents were unpredictable, sometimes pulling a boat sideways with a force that felt deliberate, almost personal. But the university men were thrilled. They lowered their instruments and began measuring the depth. And when the readings came back, the numbers were staggering. The water in the deepest canyon was over 4,000 feet deep, far deeper than anyone had expected. One of the university men wrote in his journal that night that it was like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing the bottom was not just far away, it was gone. That was the night the first wrong thing happened. It was small. So small that most of the men did not even notice it. The cook was cleaning the evening meal off the deck, fish scraps, bones, bits of bread, and tossing them over the side the way he always did. He told the captain later that when the scraps hit the water, something moved below the surface. Not a splash, not a fish jumping. A shadow, something large enough to block the fading light that filtered down through the first few feet of water. He said it moved slowly, the way a cloud moves across the sun, and then it was gone. The cook was a man who had spent 40 years at sea. He had seen whales, sharks, pods of dolphins that stretched to the horizon. He said this was different. He could not say how. He just said it felt different. The captain listened and said nothing. But that night, he loaded the rifle. The next morning, the university men lowered a large dredging net into the deepest part of the canyon. They let it sink for a long time, feeding out rope hand over hand, watching the coils disappear into water so dark it looked like ink. When they finally began to pull it back up, the rope was heavy, much heavier than it should have been, and it took 4 men straining at the winch to bring it in. When the net finally broke the surface, it was torn, not frayed the way a net wears out over time, but torn in long, clean cuts, as if something with enormous strength and very sharp edges had simply pulled it apart. Inside the ruined net, tangled in the remaining mesh, they found 3 things. A deep-water fish of a species none of them recognized, already dead and partially crushed. A chunk of something gray and rubbery that smelled so foul that 2 of the men vomited over the rail, and a single tooth. The tooth was the length of a man's hand from wrist to fingertip. It was dark, almost black, triangular, and serrated along both edges like a saw blade. It was not fossilized. It was not old. The root end was still wet with what looked and smelled like blood. I should have left then. Every part of me knew it. But I stayed. That is what one of the university men wrote in his journal. And I cannot read that line without feeling something cold settle in my stomach, because you and I both know what comes after a line like that, the men argued. The fishermen wanted to leave. The university men wanted to stay. The fishermen said the tooth did not belong to anything they had ever seen, and that the torn net meant something down there was big enough and strong enough to be dangerous. The university men said that was exactly why they needed to stay. Because if something unknown lived in that canyon, documenting it would be the discovery of a lifetime. The captain listened to both sides and then made a decision that he would carry with him like a scar for the rest of his life. He agreed to stay one more day. That night, something bumped the hull of the boat. It was not a wave. The sea was calm, almost flat. That eerie kind of stillness that happens in the far north when the wind dies and the water turns to glass. The bump came from below, a single heavy impact that made the entire boat shudder and knocked a lantern off its hook in the cabin. The men came up on deck and looked over the sides, but the water was dark and still and showed them nothing. Then it happened again. Harder this time. The boat rocked to one side, and a crate slid across the deck. The cook grabbed the rail and looked down into the water and later told the captain that for just a moment, less than a second, he saw something pass beneath the boat. He said it was gray, he said it was slow, and he said it was longer than the boat. Let me say that again, because I need you to sit with it the way I had to sit with it when I first read those words. The cook, a man with 4 decades of experience on the open ocean, a man who had no reason to lie, and every reason to be precise, said that the thing he saw moving beneath their 60-foot vessel was longer than the vessel itself. Nobody slept that night. The next morning, the captain made the decision to leave. The university men protested, but the captain was firm. He said he had a duty to his crew, and his crew was frightened, and he had learned a long time ago that when the sea frightens men who have spent their whole lives on it, the smart thing to do is listen. They began pulling in the remaining equipment and preparing to sail back toward the coast. The weather was still clear, the wind was light, and under normal circumstances, the trip back to the village would have taken 2 days, maybe 3. But circumstances were not normal. They had been sailing for about 4 hours when one of the crewmen at the stern called out. He pointed behind the boat, at the water in their wake, and when the other men came to look, they saw it, a shape just below the surface, maybe 200 yards behind them. It was following them. It was keeping pace. This was the moment they understood what they were actually dealing with. The captain ordered more sail. The engine was already running at full power, pushing the boat through the water at a speed that should have been more than enough to outrun anything biological, but the shape behind them did not fall back. It stayed at the same distance, 200 yards, like it was tethered to the boat by an invisible line. When the boat turned, the shape turned. When the boat slowed, the shape slowed. It was not chasing them. It was accompanying them, the way a cat follows a mouse across a room, not because it is hungry yet, but because it knows. The fishermen were terrified. These were men who had survived storms that sank other boats, men who had hauled nets in waters cold enough to stop a heart, men who did not frighten easily. But this was something outside their understanding. And the fear I read about in those journals was not the sharp, electric fear of a sudden danger. It was the slow, heavy fear of something patient, something that had all the time in the world. One of the crewmen wrote that it felt like being watched by something that had been watching things for longer than people had been alive. He was more right than he knew, because what I eventually learned, after years of research and dozens of conversations with marine scientists, is that the waters around Iceland are home to something ancient. The species is known today, and it has a name, but in those days, in that part of the world, it was known only through stories that fishermen told each other in low voices over drinks in dark rooms. It is a shark. But it is not like any shark most people have ever heard of. It lives in the deepest, coldest water in the North Atlantic at depths of over 4,000 feet. It grows slowly, so slowly that it does not reach maturity until it is about 150 years old. And it lives, and this is the part that makes the hair on my arm stand up every single time I say it, it lives for over 400 years. Some scientists believe it may live for 500. That means that a shark alive today in those waters may have been born before the first European ship ever crossed the Atlantic. It was already old when entire empires rose and fell. It was already hunting in the dark before your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were born. But here is the thing that no one talks about. The ones that have been documented, the ones that scientists have measured and studied, max out at about 21 feet. That is the confirmed record. 21 feet. Big, yes, terrifying in its own right. But what those men saw in 1921 was not 21 feet. Multiple witnesses, in separate accounts written at different times, estimated the length of what followed their boat at somewhere between 60 and 80 feet. And before you dismiss that as the exaggeration of frightened men, let me tell you something. The deep trenches where this expedition was working have never been fully explored. Not then. Not now. We have better maps of the surface of the moon than we do of the bottom of those canyons. We do not know what lives down there. We do not know how big it can get. We do not know how old the oldest ones are. All we know is that the conditions in those depths, the cold, the pressure, the dark, the near-total absence of competition, are exactly the conditions that allow certain species to grow far, far beyond what we consider their normal limits. For 3 days, the shape followed the boat. During the day, it stayed deep, visible only as a shadow beneath the surface, a darkness within the darkness of the water. But at night, it rose. On the first night after they started heading back, several of the men heard something they had never heard before and could not explain. A low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the water itself, not a sound made by the wind or the waves, but something deeper, something that you felt more than heard, in your ribs and your teeth and the base of your skull. The cook said it reminded him of the sound a church bell makes after it has been struck, that long, fading vibration that hangs in the air. Except this did not fade. It came and went in slow pulses, like breathing. On the second night, the thing came closer. One of the university men was on watch, sitting at the stern with a lantern, keeping his eyes on the water behind them. He wrote in his journal, and these are his words, not mine, that at some point past midnight, the water behind the boat began to glow, not brightly, not like a light, but faintly, the way certain deep-sea creatures produce their own light, a cold, blue-green shimmer that moved beneath the surface in a shape so large that his mind could not process it as a single living thing. He wrote that it was like watching a hillside shift in the dark. He wrote that the glow outlined something with a head that was wider than the boat, and a body that stretched back into the darkness beyond what the light could show. He wrote that he saw for just a moment an eye, and that the eye was the size of a dinner plate, and that it was looking at him, not past him, not through him, at him. He did not scream. He simply stood up, walked to the captain's cabin, woke the captain, and said very quietly, "It knows we are here. It has always known." Now listen, I know what you might be thinking. You are thinking this sounds impossible. You are thinking that no shark can grow to that size, that these men were cold and scared and seeing things that were not there. And I understand that. I sat with that same doubt for years. But here is what I keep coming back to. These accounts were not written for an audience. These journals were private. Some of them were not found until decades later, tucked into the walls of old houses or buried in boxes and attics. The men who wrote them had no reason to lie. They had every reason to downplay what they saw, because admitting to something like this in a fishing village in Iceland in 1921 was not a path to respect or admiration. It was a path to being called a fool, and yet they wrote it down anyway, in small, careful handwriting, in the margins of logbooks and on the backs of envelopes, because they could not keep it inside. And if you have been here with me this far, if this story has gotten under your skin the way it got under mine, that I want to ask you something real quick. Hit that subscribe button, not because I need the numbers, but because stories like this one, the kind that sit in the dark and wait to be found, they take a long time to dig up. Years. And I keep digging because people like you keep showing up to listen. So if you want to make sure you never miss one, subscribe. Leave a comment telling me what you think this thing was and stay with me. Because what happened next is the part that still keeps me awake. On the third night, the creature attacked. It was not the sudden explosive violence that you see in movies. It was slow, deliberate, patient. The boat was making good time toward the coast, maybe 18 hours from the safety of the harbor, when the engine stopped. Just stopped. No coughing, no sputtering, just silence. The men below went to check and found that something had struck the propeller shaft from below with enough force to bend the metal. The boat was dead in the water. They had sails, but the wind had dropped to nothing, and they sat there, motionless on a sea that looked like dark glass, and they waited. The bump came at 2:30 in the morning. Then another, each one harder than the last, each one in a different spot along the hull, as if the thing below was testing the boat, learning its shape, finding its weak points. The men huddled in the center of the deck away from the rails. The captain held the rifle. The cook was praying. One of the younger crewmen was crying, not loudly, just a quiet, steady stream of tears that he did not bother to wipe away. Then the boat lifted. Not rocked. Not tilted. Lifted. Lifted. The bow rose out of the water at an angle that sent men sliding across the deck, grabbing at ropes and railings and each other. Equipment crashed. The water that had been sitting in the bilge rushed to the stern with a sound like a river. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, the front third of the boat was in the air, held up by something beneath it, and then it dropped, and the slam of the hull hitting the water knocked 2 men off their feet and cracked a beam in the deck. The captain fired the rifle into the water. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was enormous in the silence, each shot cracking across the flat sea like a whip. For a moment everything was still. Then the boat shuddered one more time, a long, slow vibration that ran from stern to bow like a sigh, and then it stopped. The shape pulled away. They could see it go, a darkness moving through the dark water, heading back toward the deep. It moved slowly, the way it had moved the whole time, as if speed were something it had never needed and never would. One man was hurt. The crewman who had been crying had been thrown against the rail when the boat dropped, and his arm was broken badly, the bone visible through the skin. The cook said it as best he could with strips of wood and cloth, and the young man did not cry out, not once. He just stared at the water with eyes that had gone somewhere else. They got the sails up by morning. A thin wind came from the southeast, barely enough to move the boat, but they took it. The trip that should have taken 18 hours took almost 2 full days, and in all that time the men took shifts watching the water behind them. For the first day they saw nothing. The sea was empty. The sky was clear. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the ocean had simply swallowed the event whole and moved on. But on the second day, in the last hours before they reached the coast, the cook saw it one more time. Far behind them, maybe half a mile back, something broke the surface. Just for a moment, just long enough to see a dorsal fin that rose out of the water like a gray sail, taller than any fin he had ever seen or heard of, and then it slid back down, and the water closed over it, and it was gone. The water remembers. The captain had said it on the 3rd night of the trip, sitting on the deck with his pipe, and at the time it had sounded like an old man's poetry, something pretty but not quite real. Now it sounded like something else entirely. Now it sounded like a warning. They reached the village on a Tuesday afternoon. The harbor was quiet. The captain's daughter was standing on the dock with her painted stone, and when the boat came in, she held it up the way she always did, and the captain waved back. But the men who were there that day said his hand was shaking and his face was the color of ash. The crew tied up the boat and unloaded their things in silence. Nobody spoke about what had happened. Not that day. Not for a long time. The university men took the tooth and the samples and the torn net back with them. Their report, when it was finally published months later, made no mention of a creature following the boat. It described the torn net as damage from subsurface geological features. It listed the tooth as unidentified cetacean material. It was, in every way that mattered, a lie, but I understand why they lied. Because the truth was something that did not belong in a report. It did not fit into footnotes or data tables. It was too big and too wrong and too alive. The men who stayed in the village, the fishermen and the cook and the captain, they carried it differently. They did not write reports. They wrote letters, diary entries, notes to themselves in the quiet hours of the night when the rest of the world was asleep, and those notes, scattered across decades and tucked into the hidden places of their lives, tell a story that the official record never would. The captain never sailed past the side of the coast again. He fished close to shore for the rest of his working life, and when anyone asked him why, he would say that the deep water had nothing left to offer him. His daughter grew up and had children of her own, And she told me, decades later, in a small kitchen that smelled of coffee and wool, that her father would sometimes stand at the window at night and look out toward the sea with an expression she could never quite read. She said it was not fear exactly. It was something more like respect, the kind of respect you give to something that could destroy you but chose, for its own reasons, not to. The young crewman with the broken arm healed, but he never went back to sea. He moved inland, took up work on a farm, and lived a quiet life. His wife told their children that their father had been hurt in a fishing accident, and that was all she ever said about it. But when he died in 1963, they found a drawing in his bedside table, a simple pencil sketch on yellowed paper, showing a boat on calm water, and beneath it, in the dark, a shape. The shape was enormous. It dwarfed the boat the way a whale dwarfs a minnow. And in the center of the shape, the man had drawn a single circle, carefully shaded, with a tiny dot in the middle. The cook, lived the longest of any of them. He kept fishing until he was well into his 70s, and he was known in the village as a man who told good stories. Stories about storms, about the old days, about fish so big that bent the rods double. But there was one story he never told in public. He told it only once, late in life, to a nephew who had asked him what the worst thing he had ever seen at sea was. The cook was quiet for a long time, and then he said something that the nephew wrote down and kept. He said, "People think the ocean is water. It is not water. It is time, all the time that has ever been, pressed together, and the things that live in it, the old things, the deep things, they are not fish. They are memories with teeth." I do not know what followed that boat in 1921. I do not know if it was a species we have a name for, grown beyond any size we thought possible in the crushing dark of a trench we have never reached. I do not know if it was something that has no name at all, something that has been swimming in those waters since before there were people to be afraid of it. I do not know if it is still there, but I know this. The Greenland shark, the species that science says lives in those waters, has been confirmed to live for over 400 years. 400 years. Think about what that means. A shark born in those waters in 1500 is still alive today. It was alive when ships first sailed to the New World. It was alive during every war, every plague, every invention, every moment of human history that you have ever read about. And that is just the ones we have found, the ones we have measured and tagged and tested. The deep trenches, the old wounds, the places where the ocean floor drops into darkness. Those places have not been measured. Those places have not been explored. We do not know what is down there. We only know that the conditions in those places, the cold, the pressure, the isolation, the absence of anything to limit growth, are the exact conditions that would allow something to grow far older and far larger than anything we have ever documented. The expedition of 1921 was not the only time something like this was reported. Fishermen along the coast of Iceland and Greenland have told similar stories for centuries. Stories of shadows in the deep water, of boats being followed, of something vast and slow and old moving beneath the surface. Most of those stories are dismissed as legend. Most of them are forgotten. But they keep coming. Every generation, from every stretch of that cold, dark coast, the same story rises to the surface like something that cannot stay down. The water remembers. I used to think that was just something an old captain said to make the night feel bigger. Now I am not so sure, because the more I dig into this, the more I find. And the more I find, the less I understand, and the less I understand, the more I think that maybe the old fishermen were right. Maybe the ocean is not just water. Maybe it is a living record, older than us, deeper than us, and full of things that do not care whether we believe in them or not. The last entry in the captain's journal, written years after the expedition, on a night when the wind was howling off the sea and the windows of his small house were rattling in their frames, says this: "I have lived a long life on the water, and the water has been mostly kind to me, but I know now that kindness is not the same as safety. The sea lets us pass over it because it chooses to, and what lives beneath it lets us pass for the same reason. We are not the masters of the deep. We are guests, and I have met the host." I think about that line a lot. I think about a 7-year-old girl holding up a painted stone on a dock, and a father waving back with a shaking hand. I think about a young man staring at the water with empty eyes while someone sets his broken bone. I think about a cook singing old songs that nobody else knows the words to. And I wonder if those songs were about the same thing, if every generation on that coast has been singing the same quiet warning in 100 different melodies. I think about a tooth the length of a man's hand, black and serrated and fresh, pulled from a depth we have not returned to since. And I think about the fact that right now, tonight, in the dark water off the coast of Iceland, in the trenches that have no bottom anyone has found, something is moving. Slowly, patiently, the way it has been moving for hundreds of years, maybe thousands. It does not know your name. It does not care about your world. It was here before you. It will be here after. And the only thing standing between you and it is a thin layer of water and the comfortable belief that we've already found everything there is to find. We have not. The fishermen of that village have a saying that has been passed down for longer than anyone can trace. They say it to each other when the weather turns bad and the boats come in early and the men sit around the fire drying their nets and trying not to look at the sea. They say it quietly, almost under their breath, the way you say something that you believe but do not want to believe. They say, do not look too long at the deep water, because the deep water is already looking at you. I used to think that was just a story, something old people said to keep children away from the dock at night. But then I read those journals. Then I held that sketch of an eye drawn by a man who could not sleep for 40 years. Then I stood on that dock in that harbor and looked out at the water, and the water was dark and still and endless. And I felt, just for a moment, just for one quick breath, something looking back. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was the wind or the cold or the weight of too many stories pressing down on a mind that had spent too long in the dark. Maybe. But the fishermen do not think so, and the more time I spend with this story, the more I think they are the ones who have it right, because they are the ones who have lived beside that water for 1,000 years, and they are the ones who know what the rest of us are only beginning to understand. The sea is not empty. It has never been empty, and the things that live in its deepest, oldest places are not hiding from us. They are waiting. They have always been waiting. And they are very, very patient. I found one more document while I was researching this story. It was a letter written by the cook to his own son, dated 1947, 26 years after the expedition. Most of the letter is ordinary. Family news, weather, the price of fish. But at the end, almost as an afterthought, he wrote a paragraph that I have read 100 times and still cannot read without feeling something shift inside me. He wrote, "Your mother asks me sometimes why I still go out on the water after what happened. I tell her it is because I am a fisherman and the sea is my life. But that is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I go out because I need to know it is still there, not because I want to see it again. God knows I do not want to see it again, but because as long as it is there, as long as something that old and that large and that patient is still moving through the dark beneath us, then the world is bigger than we think it is, and I would rather live in a world that is too big to understand than one that is too small to matter." I sat with those words for a long time. I sat in that small kitchen in that old village with the wind outside and the smell of coffee and the sound of the harbor through the window, and I thought about what it means to know that something ancient is still out there, still moving, still watching, and I realized that the feeling I had was not fear. It was something closer to awe. The kind of awe that does not make you feel small in a bad way, but small in the way that standing under a clear sky full of stars makes you feel small. Like you are a tiny part of something so much bigger and so much older that your mind can only touch the edge of it before pulling back. That is the true horror of this story, if you want to call it horror. It is not that something terrible lives in the deep. It is that something terrible has always lived in the deep, and we built our entire understanding of the world on the idea that we already knew what was down there. We did not. We do not. And every net that comes up torn, every boat that shudders in calm water, every fisherman who looks over the rail and sees a shadow that is longer than his vessel, every single one of those moments is the world tapping us on the shoulder and saying, gently, carefully, The way you tell a child something they are not ready to hear. You do not know where you live. The captain's daughter was the last person I spoke to for this story. She was very old by then, her hair white, her hands thin and spotted, but her eyes were still sharp and bright, the kind of eyes that do not miss anything. I asked her if she believed what her father had seen. She looked at me for a long time, and then she reached into a drawer and pulled out a small painted stone, smooth and round, with faded blue and green paint on one side. She held it up, the way she used to hold it up on the dock when she was 7 years old, and she said, "The sea took my father's peace. It took his sleep. It took the part of him that used to laugh, but it gave him something too. It gave him the truth. And the truth is heavy and cold, and it does not care if you are ready for it, but it is still the truth." She put the stone back in the drawer and closed it, and that was the end of our conversation. I drove back to my hotel that night along a dark road that ran beside the sea, and the water was black and flat and still, and the sky was that pale Icelandic gold that never quite goes dark, and I kept my eyes on the road because I did not want to look at the water. I did not want to look, but I could feel it looking at me, and somewhere out there, in the deep, in the cold, in the dark, in the old wounds where the ocean floor drops away into nothing, something turned, slowly, the way it has always turned, and kept swimming. It is still swimming now.